I guess one of the premises of the book for me was that that seaweed provides quite a good example of kind of quite an important custodial species in the ocean, which we could potentially use to learn from how to actually be a better custodial species for ourselves on the land.
Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you in part by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and Coastal Creative.
Are you tired of generic mass-produced soaps that contain complicated ingredients and do little to give back? Well, we've got just the soap for you. Introducing Chopping Block Soap, a small family business dedicated to bringing the warmth and care of homemade soaps right to your doorstep. What started as a humble idea, Chopping Block Soap has blossomed into a booming family hobby that we can't wait to share with you. What sets them apart? All Chopping Block soaps and skincare products are crafted using the same food-grade based ingredients, ensuring each bar is a little piece of handmade perfection. You can find their soap and other soap products at choppingblocksoap.com and use the discount Shellphone for 20% off your order. That's choppingblocksoap.com.
I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us today is Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Matt from Australia. I'm actually on Tangerang country, which is where I live, which is in Victoria, so southern Australia. And I mean, I guess we've been connected over the kind of shared love of the ocean and specifically seaweed for me, which has become a bit of a special interest, and I'm not actually sure how that happened. You know, obviously Australia is surrounded by water. We've got quite a lot of kind of water stories and water culture, especially First Nations people in Australia. So, yeah, I mean, I'm a writer. I've written a book about seaweed, which we'll kind of talk about today. But I guess largely I have no idea how I stumbled into the kind of the seaweed world. The stuff that I write about is about kind of humans and their connection to the natural world and ecosystems and stuff. And that was kind of my entrance into seaweed, was thinking about ocean ecosystems. And then, yeah, I don't know, for some reason, we've got some kind of seaweed enthusiasts down here in Victoria that kind of joke, but I kind of think it's semi-serious, that we may have eaten some magical seaweed sushi at some point, and it's kind of affected our cognitive function, and now we all have to do this work and speak on behalf of seaweed. I think that's possibly what's happened here. So I'm trying to do my best.
Nice, yeah, kind of like hypnotized by the seaweed, and now you're completely into it.
Yeah, and like it is hypnotizing. It's so hypnotic. Like even the way it kind of moves in the water. Obviously, from a metaphorical point of view, there was something so magnetic and pulling about this squishy aquatic plant thing. Is it a plant? You know, it's its own thing. There was just something so amazing to me about this thing. So, yeah, definitely hypnotic. And I'm still hypnotized by it. I feel like seaweed's got its fronds around me, and I definitely can't get away.
I was going to save this question for the end, but I feel like now would be a great time to ask. Do you have a favorite kind of seaweed?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked the last question first. I like flipping everything around. This would probably be a common favorite, but I mean, the large bull kelp was probably my first kind of immersive experience, I would say, in a seaweed forest, you know. And I think particularly down in Australia, we've lost, in the last kind of 15 years, we've lost 95% of our large kelp forests, you know, especially down in Tasmania. But I have swum in a few of them, diving for abalone and stuff, and you literally just enter another world down there. The light changes, the light's kind of refracting through the water, and there's these massive fronds that go all the way down to the ground, the massive holdfast. There's I ran into a shark when I was down there. There's seals down there. I mean, so possibly that memory for me is so visceral. So I'd probably say, yeah, the large bull kelps. Just so stunning. So that would be my answer, which is probably everyone's kind of favourite. I hate that I just gave like a big seaweed. I really enjoy the really little ones too.
I mean, if it's everybody's favorite, then it is for a reason, I guess.
I think the way I kind of think about seaweed is very much associated with that experience of diving into a world in a forest. I very much see seaweed as almost like a symbol of ocean ecosystem as ecosystem. And that's kind of quite important for me. You know, I guess I'm a seaweed enthusiast, but that for me feels like it's got something more to do with the ocean, you know, the entirety of the ocean rather than just one, you know, rather than marine algae.
Yeah, that sounds like an awesome experience. Like, I hopefully have a similar one someday. My one, like, big memory of seaweed is, well, I'm from the state of Maine here in the US, and during, I believe it was middle school, I randomly went with a teacher who was studying seaweed that kind of washes up on like the rocky coast there. And I guess I was shadowing her. And so we like were collecting data on the seaweed that was there. But I don't remember what specific kind it was. I feel like I need to educate myself a little and figure out exactly what that was. Because in your book, which we'll talk about in a second more specifically, like on the inside covers, there's the illustrations of all the different, or not all of the different, but a lot of different kinds of seaweed on there. And I loved opening it and seeing like that was the very first thing you see.
Yeah, that's I would say about that story on multiple levels. It's pretty, I mean, I know that Maine, I guess most of kind of North America is quite advanced with their kind of seaweed knowledge and seaweed farming and stuff. But it's amazing that you got to shadow a teacher doing that work. Like, that is not something that is common, especially in Australia. So that's amazing. And secondly, I mean, people get really obsessed with IDing plants and algae and stuff. Like, there's like 10,000 species or 12,000 species of marine algae. There's obviously some common ones. So in the front of my book, there's like 25 common ones, and most of them are common to Australia, but some of them you'll find kind of all around the world. So, yeah, that was kind of an important part of the book, was like, you know, how do we frame this as something that is hopefully going to be something that people use to connect with the beach, you know, go out, go to the beach. That was basically part of the premise of the book, was can we get people to just engage with the ocean? I don't so much care if they get seaweed and seagrass mixed up. You know, the marine scientists get really, really frustrated when people mix things up like that or mis-ID things. For me, it's like, if you're on the beach engaging with that ecosystem, that's a great first step.
Before we get too far into talking about it, just so I make sure that I say it, your book is called With a Little Kelp from Our Friends, and it's an illustrated children's book, you could call it, but I also feel like it's more of an anyone's book. It's very educational, but there are kind of different levels of information in there. I feel like if you wanted to read more specifically about processes like photosynthesis or like different light reflections, changing the color of the seaweed, there's that in there, but then there's also more of just a theme of like connection and like relating back to how seaweed connects to us as people, how we can find it in our environments, how we use it and interact with it, which kind of goes into what you were just talking about with not being so strict about the scientific part of it.
Yeah, I love that synopsis of my book. The book is almost 70 pages. It's quite a large format picture book. And as you said, it kind of covers, well, I mean, it starts off, 3.5 billion years ago as kind of these little microorganisms were doing this thing called photosynthesis for the first time. And then it tracks all the way up to kind of modern human history and our kind of relationship with it over the years. But I've tried to give synopsises of that book quite a few times, and I don't think they were as good as how you just described it, because I feel like the connection piece for me is really important. But also you mentioned that there's kind of layers of meaning or information, and that's quite an astute reading. The fun part of doing that book was working with metaphor and obviously illustrations. So the book's illustrated by a UK artist called Liz Rowland, who spent a little bit of time down in Melbourne where I live, who I absolutely adore. And you can put so much information, almost like coding it into the images, and there's far more illustrative power than there are power from the words in the book. And that was kind of part of the challenging but really rewarding part of the book, was just doing that kind of work. And much like seaweeds kind of sticking to me, you just hope that kind of stuff just sticks to people. And I feel like that's a function of picture books, that they're able to do that. It's an incredible kind of genre of literature, the picture book.
Now that you say that, it gave me the thought that I think you could almost read this book without looking at or reading any of the words. The illustrations kind of tell the story so well alongside the words that you could just look through those too and kind of get the general idea.
Well, that's good. That was kind of our intention specifically for this book. We kind of worked on the book a little bit differently to a lot of other picture books that aren't illustrated and written by the same person. So I worked on the words, but then I worked directly with Liz, the illustrator, on the illustrations. And actually, as I was writing the manuscript for the book, which, as a side note, a really daunting thing that happens is that because picture books, they can obviously be in heaps of different sizes. So for me, because I wanted to, whilst I was writing the manuscript, also write how I wanted the page to look. So as I was thinking about the words for the spreads, I was also briefing directly Liz the spreads. So everything you kind of see in the book is designed by Liz, but was very much pictured in my head as I was writing the words. And what they did actually before I wrote the first manuscript was they sent me a blank copy of the book, and I've still got it. And it was so amazing because it was kind of like this 70-page blank, totally white. And so for me, from the very beginning, I was totally thinking about how to feel that visually with the story, and really how to practice a little bit of restraint with my words, how to really just pull them back and just let kind of the visuals of because the visuals of the ocean are just so beautiful. And also for those that will get their hands on the book, Liz Rowland, the illustrator's style, I mean, a major part of why I really wanted her to work on the book, but her style is just so playful. She'll draw like a shark, and it won't really kind of look like a shark. It might have like 3 fins, and it's just really cool. And that was a big part of the briefing of the book when I briefed her for the illustrations was, please don't make this look too scientific and stuff, because in the book there is quite a lot of science, but I really didn't want to have that take away from kind of the magic and the imaginative potential of what the illustrations could do. So there's seagulls. I think there's some seagulls in the book on one of the spreads, and they're just like my favorite things. They kind of look like a paper aeroplane, like they could be anything, and I adore that about this book.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and see if I can find those seagulls.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously do little fun things that slot in there. And I mean, a lot of the time, the entire time, it was like, look, this is how I see it, but you have your own relationship also with the text. She was reading the words, but also with the ocean, with seaweed, like bring that in. I wasn't like a dictator. I mean, also, like, I will kind of say I do kind of feel a little bit weird about having my name like in large font on the front cover. I've always felt super weird about it because, I mean, I did kind of talk to the publisher at one point of like, do I actually need my name on the book? Like, there's so many people that make this thing happen, not only Liz and stuff, but so many scientists and researchers and people, even just people in my life that have kind of, like the crew that I went abalone diving with into the kelp forest, like those people should kind of be on the book in some capacity. So I do kind of feel a little bit weird about centering my own kind of voice in this book, even though obviously I've written it. But yeah, I would like to say, I guess, that there are so many people that make these books happen. So I guess I'm now speaking for them, on behalf of them.
We kind of talked in a previous conversation about what went into learning about all of the information that you put in this book about the more like science-y but also historical side of seaweed. And as I was reading through it, I was thinking, I wish I knew all of those sources where you gathered information from, even though you did a lot of work in like bringing it together and condensing it down to go into this form. So I guess we could talk about that now. I'd love to hear more about that process of actually writing the book and finding and thinking about the information that you ended up putting in there, and who helped you along the way with that.
Good question. Where do I begin? I mean, in some capacity, there are people that have taken me to the ocean, introduced me to the ocean, talked about the ocean, since when I was a kid. So, potentially it was in me at a young age, but I started researching seaweed 5 or 6 years ago. And so the book came out 3 years ago, early 2021. So about 3 or 4 years before then, maybe 3 years, I was editing a magazine in Melbourne. The magazine was focused on sustainability, but when I was editing there, I really shifted it really into a bit more of a focus on regenerative agriculture, which is kind of what I was interested in at the time and still a big passion of mine. And I was writing a little illustrated piece for one of the issues, and I don't know how I learned about it, but I found out about seaweed farming. So I wrote an illustrated piece about seaweed farming and also about silvopasture, which is kind of a similar thing, but it's kind of like an agroforestry technique on land that involves kind of grazing livestock and tree harvest. So in researching for that little illustrated piece, which I also used Liz for that, I was looking into a lot of Paul Hawkins' work of breeding drawdown, and he had a kind of a future potential chapter in the back of his book that talked about a few things, and seaweed farming was one of these kind of future opportunities. And then there's a really popular marine scientist, also like a paleoscientist, Tim Flannery in Australia, and he's written a couple of books on seaweed. And I actually got to meet him on like the Great Barrier Reef when I was researching the book. But essentially it started because I was doing this tiny little piece, like an extra little piece for this magazine I was working at. And essentially the publisher saw that piece and contacted me and was like, do you want to develop this into a picture book, like a larger picture book? And, at that time had researched seaweed for that little piece and had become just obsessed with it. And then, it took me probably another 2 years to just kind of like sink into the research. And I mean, as you can kind of tell, I don't really know where it came from. There also isn't heaps of stuff on seaweed. I guess there wasn't like 5 years ago. There wasn't lots. There's a few kind of like good books that kind of track the history of seaweed, kind of like more anthropology kind of stuff, which I found quite interesting. There's some really, really deep and strong knowledge, First Nations knowledge of seaweed here in Australia, and a lot of that is women's business. So I've got a friend at Deakin University, one of the universities here, which has a really, really strong kind of seaweed science lab. I kind of worked with them quite a bit, some PhD grads, and they kind of introduced me to a bunch of kind of more scientific PhD type papers. And a big part of that was there's a spread in the book about First Nations Australians' connection to seaweed. And that came from one of the PhD grads there speaking to these the First Nations women around Australia. And a lot of that knowledge is still just within their culture hasn't really come out yet. And then, I mean, also a lot of the research was engaging with the art community, you know, how they were thinking about seaweed. So there's a friend of mine, Lycan, down here in Melbourne that started the Seaweed Appreciation Society, and kind of joined that and became quite enamoured by them as I was kind of writing the manuscript for the book. I actually worked on the manuscript on a floating houseboat whilst I was on artist residency with Lycan and the Seaweed Appreciation Society. So, yeah, I mean, that doesn't really answer your question, but I basically just pulled it from everywhere, and it took a long time to compile it all, and then it took an even longer time to fit it into a picture book with few words.
I think that answers the question. I mean, the book covers like such a broad scope, like so many topics that all tie back to the central focus of seaweed, that your answer makes a lot of sense. Like, one thing that you mentioned about historical, like anthropological, that perspective of all this was really cool, because I also study anthropology, and there is a lot of knowledge that stays closely tied within Native communities, or just in general closely tied to history, and then ends up getting lost over time. And then also the section about the role of women in those spaces of collecting seaweed, using it in different ways in different places across the world.
I would say, like, I'm glad you mentioned the women's connection specifically to the ocean, because, you know, in the book there is 2 double-page spreads on, well, I mean, I guess the title of those pages is Women in the Sea. And I know I just mentioned that a lot of the First Nations knowledge is here in Australia around not only seaweed, just the ocean is women's knowledge. And yeah, as you said, as I was researching for the book and looking into how other cultures engage with seaweed, there was like a clear connection specifically between women and the ocean. And there's a really interesting connection between, ocean-based cultures and matriarchal societies, you know, women-dominated kind of like cultures, whether you look at Korea, some places in Japan, like Tanzania. At the moment, you know, Tanzania, there's a kind of like a budding seaweed farming movement there, which is predominantly done by women, and also down here in Australia. But that was one of the really interesting things that came just from the research and sitting with it, was just noticing these things. And the cool thing about a picture book is that you don't have to provide any kind of analytical explanation to why this might be the case. You just present it, like, Women in the Sea. Here is some of the history of some cultures, and specifically women that have engaged with this stuff, and you don't have to say anything else. And I'm used to being analytical about this stuff and providing some kind of an explanation, which would on some level potentially have something to do with how the patriarchy potentially has a hard time controlling the intertidal zone, because it's so fluid and it moves and it's so gnarly sometimes that possibly it's just not really able to get its grip into the intertidal. You find that these communities that are matriarchal can thrive there. That would be one way of looking at it. But the interesting thing about doing a picture book is you don't have to do any of that stuff. You know, you can just kind of put it out there and see what people pick up on.
This is going to be kind of a broad question, but I was wondering if you would like to kind of give us like some highlights from the book of like information that you think, if people are just listening to the podcast right now and they might not be able to get their hands on the book, like what you would like them to know about seaweed.
Well, there's all sorts of like geeky stuff at the start of the book around kind of seaweed anatomy that I find really, really interesting. A lot of it has to do with kind of this photosynthetic thing that they kind of invented, early algal forms. But possibly some of that really interesting stuff for me was around the back third of the book, once we've established kind of what seaweed is and how the ocean ecosystems work. and also how humans have kind of engaged with it. We then cover climate change and ocean acidification, warming ocean waters and stuff. And I mean, a lot of that stuff for me was, it's hard to find that balance between hope and just this is actually what's happening, especially for kids kind of reading it for the first time. But there's just little kind of more visceral, emotive stuff for me, like learning that ocean acidity, which increases as you get more carbon in the ocean, that it actually affects the marine experience of fish and stuff. So this more acidic water, it makes sound go further. So it's louder in the ocean for fish. And it also affects their sense of smell. You know, just learning that stuff, for me, there's a bunch of those kinds of things in the book where you're kind of invited to imagine yourself as a fish in this environment. You can imagine, like, if we just walked outside and we couldn't really smell anything, and that, like, we could just, like, the sounds were so amplified, it would be so paralyzing. So those kinds of things at the back of the book around climate change, and just using it as a, like, this is a different experience now for these kind of life forms that live in the ocean. Imagine what that would be like if that was you. Because I guess one of the premises of the book for me was that that seaweed provides quite a good example of kind of quite an important custodial species in the ocean, which we could potentially use to learn from how to actually be a better custodial species for ourselves on the land.
There's definitely more towards the end of the book about that topic, but I think throughout you kind of weave in hints of that topic of climate change and the changes that that's creating in our water systems. And then at the end, we learn more about, like, specifics like the ocean acidification or pollution, things like that. And then it kind of shifts into, but here's where it can get better. And we hear that side of, this is the role that seaweed could have in helping if we work with it and start to do something with that. It's a little bit of a bringing awareness and then introducing a call to action without making it seem like scary or like too big of a project to dip our toes into.
You kind of mentioned it just before about some kind of a collective forgetting around a lot of this stuff. And I really feel like part of the problem here is that we've forgotten a bunch of stuff. We have such a strong ocean stewardship history as humans. You know, it's just recently we've just forgotten all of these stories and all of these ways of relating. And I feel like a lot of the call to actions here is just give yourself the time to remember and, like, feel into this stuff, because it's in all of us. Just the general kind of affinity for all of these other life forms. And we understand ecosystems. Like, we understand what it feels like to be in one. We understand what it feels like to be a custodial kind of species that can seriously change environments, you know. And I feel like there's this key piece as a call to action of just remembering. And a lot of that has to do with talking to each other, listening, not only listening to seaweed and stuff, but just listening to our elders and their stories that they have to share, because it's all there. Where I'm not presenting in this book anything that, you know, is new or novel. There's potentially some stuff, as you said, in the back of the book about possible future, more novel seaweed farming techniques that, you know, haven't really been scaled and stuff. But for the most part, yeah, as you said, I was also just foraging for information from connections that I'd made and presenting it to people in a way that they could kind of embody and share as well. So the moving from forgetting to remembering, because a lot of the forgetting is active. We're just, you know, especially in the ocean, it's so out of sight. One of the big metaphors for the ocean is that it's infinite, and it's just this blue bottomless pit thing. And we know that that's not true. Like, we know it. We should just forget that metaphor and engage with the fact that that's a whole world. There's whole worlds under there. And we'd be a much better placed if we remembered that.
There's a lot of different points that I could go off of on that, but I do want to quickly put in, going off of the last thing that you said, there is very much a sense that the ocean is the big unknown, and it kind of seems like sometimes we want to keep it that way because that's how we view it, but there is a lot that we know about the ocean, and there are a lot of people who are constantly trying to learn more about the parts that might still be unknown. So it doesn't have to be this big, mysterious, faraway thing at all. And I feel like the book, as part of the call to action, part of that is reconnecting. There's the remembering side, but then also reconnecting. And there's some activities at the end of the book as well to do with seaweed. There's one related to food, one related to skincare. There's just like collecting and keeping bits of different kinds of seaweed, things like that that I think are really valuable, because just creating that connection with the environment is what creates care about it. That's how you start that whole process.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's basically the regenerative mindset in a nutshell. It's all about reconnection. We would do far better if we had a little bit more reverence for those kind of underwater communities. But you had me thinking about an important part of this that we kind of haven't talked about is that we know quite a lot, leaning on the knowledge that we do have, but and kind of arming ourselves with that knowledge is super important. But it's also really important to hopefully use that knowledge to animate the world. You know, these are animate worlds, and a big part of the thing that drew me to seaweed was it's such an ostensibly inanimate object. And the challenge for me was how to make this thing animate. If you can animate seaweed, imagine the potential then for all of the other kind of life forms that are far more easy for us to imagine as animate, you know. And that also then kind of dovetails into land-based regenerative work, because another really kind of unseen, inanimate, really important part of the ecosystem is the soil. And we're destroying that in the same capacity as we're destroying the ocean. You know, these kind of like infinite, dark, you know, inanimate, in quote unquote, inanimate places that if we lent on the knowledge that we had, but we also used that to animate these places. These are living things, you know. There's a writer that I was reading recently that was talking about kelping as a verb, as a practice. And it was very similar to, I think it's David Abrams that talks about kind of radical otherness, you know, this kelping, this almost unselfing, kind of using your relationship to other life forms to decenter your own narrative and to animate those places. And I feel like that's just a really important part of this remembering reconnection work is to reconnect, but on an animate level. In the book, actually, there's a spread which is describes the life cycle of the ocean, and usually you'd have that kind of as a trophic pyramid, you know, with top apex predators up the top. But, you know, in the book it's an infinity symbol, because really that's actually more scientifically accurate. It's not really that accurate that it would be some kind of a weird pyramid, but these energies just flow and they don't stop. And humans are in that pyramid. Like if you look, I think that there's like maybe a swimmer somewhere in there. You know, there's a person in there somewhere, but they're not higher up or lower up. They're just kind of in there.
I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the state of marine education, specifically in Australia, since that's what you have the most perspective on, and also how storytelling can fit into that picture.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by this. So I'm not sure how it is in America. I would assume it's very, very different. But here in Australia, and it's more perplexing because we are literally on an island surrounded by water. Most of the coastline, especially down south where I am, is kind of amenable to seaweed. So I think South Australia, so the state across from me on the east, has the highest level of seaweed endemism in the world. There's more native seaweeds there than anywhere else. But yet, marine science isn't part of our federal or state pedagogy. So if you go into a school in Australia, you are not learning about the ocean. It is not part of the syllabus. And I actually only learned this after having recently published the book. I had no idea that, part of writing the book was that there was actually not really much in the form of some kind of a seaweed book that kids could engage with. So, on some level I knew that there was a bit of a gap there. Yeah, it's incredible. And it still isn't part of the pedagogy. And it's not because teachers aren't interested in teaching about the ocean, but essentially it's only really taught if a teacher has a specific connection to the ocean, or if they're kind of a coastal community that they can go down to the beach and engage in that way. But yeah, it's incredible that it's not part of the kind of syllabus of schools and curriculums. And I was informed by another PhD grad at Deakin University, the university that I mentioned before. She, in a great coincidental synergistic move, was doing her PhD on, and it's actually come out now. She did her research over the last few years on using children's literature to teach marine science outcomes in primary schools. And my book was one of the maybe half a dozen books that we kind of used in that study. So through that, I've connected really beautifully with Katya, the woman that did that research, and she basically just informed me about the state of the Australian school systems in relation to ocean literacy. And I share her contention, and her research kind of points to it, that textbooks are great, specifically for older kids, but children's literature, picture books, as we've described, books that have layers of information that different age groups can connect with, but also a really rich visual landscape. And also then subtle call to actions at the back of the book that can just help with that connection piece. It's not necessarily made to function as a textbook in that there's specific information that I want you to get away from it, but it's all about that connection to these environments and connection to this hopefully animate person, i.e. seaweed. So I think we might see it kind of popping up in school curriculums. I know that it's definitely happening in Maine. The World Wildlife Fund just bought 1,000 copies of my book and popped them in every elementary school and public library, I think, in Maine. And Alaska have done the same thing with my book. So, I think it's slowly making its way into schools, my book, and it's possibly where the book will find its home within the school environment. And I'm kind of really glad that I didn't create it with that in mind, but that's clearly a major kind of flaw in our education system in Australia, especially, that the ocean just doesn't even feature. And then no wonder we're exploiting it. If it's not even part of our knowledge system at all, it doesn't do well to not support that myth of this thing as a big blue bottomless pit that we can just extract from. So yeah, that's the state of marine literacy. It's in Australia. It's not that great.
I was going to mention that I kind of found your book and you, I believe, through the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. They have a little page about your book, and on that page, it mentions that they had a goal of providing a copy along with some other educational materials to every elementary school in the state in 2023, which is really great, amazing that it's, one, being provided, but also so consistently across those schools. And I hope something similar is possible in Australia as well, where, the book takes on a very global perspective, but a lot of it is still rooted in Australia. So I hope that it also finds the schools there as much and helps bring that information to them to kind of jumpstart a little bit of marine education. That's a lot for one book to do, but still even having one thing is better than none at all.
Yeah. There is a bunch of other amazing books about the ocean and seaweed and stuff. And as I said, whilst my book is specifically kind of, focused on seaweed, it really just tells the story about ocean ecosystems, possibly from a seaweed's perspective, So there are so many other books you can pull from, and I've noticed that since publishing this book, the conversations the cultural narratives start to change slowly. Like these are how, like storytelling is our cultural narrative. So it's really interesting putting something into that space and just watching it evolve with the narrative. And I'm seeing far more kind of like books come out around seaweed, so much more interest. And I've done like a few little fun, we do like book week in Australia, I think in August every year. And I've done a few really fun visits to primary schools. I mean, a lot of which have been using the book in their classroom, but that's usually because the teachers there do that in their own volition. They've been given the book by a friend or something, and then they're really into the ocean for whatever reason, and they start kind of using it in the classroom. But I've been so blessed to have been placed in some classrooms with kids with this book, because it's not something that it's not an environment that I would usually be in. And just the questions that aren't related to seaweed that just come up because you're sitting in communion with these spaces, with these books. So, questions around like, where does water come from? These really kind of abstracty, really interesting questions that have nothing necessarily to do with seaweed, but those are the kind of things that happen once you provide children, especially just with the space to explore it. And so I don't think it won't be that long until we I reckon get marine literacy in a big part of the schooling system. And, there's what was I listening to Sylvia Earle talk recently about, that they want to protect 30% of the ocean and by 2030 or some 20.
Yeah, 30 by 30.
Yeah, exactly. 30 by 30. It's now like dismally below that. But a big part of that is social licensing, getting the public to engage collectively and culturally with these stories. And so we're going to see marine and ocean science become a major part of how we bring children into the world. So that I'm really excited for where that's going to go, and hopefully my book can kind of help in some capacity.
It's great to hear like a positive change happening and get a sense of hopefulness about the future surrounding those different topics: education, the environment in general, just human connection. The other topic that I wanted to kind of get your perspective on is seaweed aquaculture, farming. There are different names for it, but how you kind of have seen that taking place either in Australia or further out, if you have a perspective on that. There is a little bit about it in the book of a couple different methods, but things get a little more complicated once you get down to actually doing that in the real world. So
yeah, definitely. That's a good way to caveat, I guess, any form of kind of more regenerative farming systems. In theory, they can sound amazing, but in practice, it's extremely hard to do. So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I think there's two kind of regenerative farming systems that involve water and the ocean that also involve seaweed. I mean, I should be asking you guys really for the tips, because North America have been doing this stuff for a long time. And I'm kind of more specifically talking about multi-trophic ocean farms that involve multiple species. So you usually have seaweed, shellfish, fish. Basically, you're growing a little forest and you're harvesting from that forest, as opposed to a monocrop of mussels or a monocrop of seaweed or something like that. So really, all of my inspiration and enthusiasm for that has come from North America, really, like the work that Brendan Smith's been doing. But I mean, it's really interesting to think about the Australian context, and I'm quite passionate about the Australian seaweed industry and the potential for that, because at the moment it basically doesn't exist. there's basically 3 kind of large commercial seaweed farms in Australia. So the book really kind of came out as this more political narrative around the seaweed industry in Australia. And there's so much hype about seaweed. There's like the Australian seaweed industry in Australia that was really pushing the scalability of the seaweed industry. But we're not really seeing this multi-trophic kind of, I think Brand Smith calls it 3D ocean farming. So you're farming within the 3-dimensional space, utilising seaweed's potential to deacidify the water, to therefore then grow shellfish, and then you get fish coming in there that you can potentially harvest. And we're not really seeing that in Australia at the moment. Most of the seaweed farms here are monocots. It's a little bit trickier down here in Australia because we don't have the political regulations to allow ocean leases as easy as they do in North America. So in Australia, you can't very easily go get a lease for some water. And especially around seaweed mariculture, that doesn't even really feature within the political environment in Australia. It's so new that they haven't really caught the regulations up. So we're on a political level, and I've engaged a little bit with some state government here in Australia just to get clear on what the regulations are if one wanted to lease some water and farm seaweed in a certain way. And really, they just don't have the regulations for it yet. Seaweed just doesn't really feature within their political dialogue. So in Australia, it's really embryonic, but I guess I'm slightly worried that we'll just start to see large organisations industrialise the water like they have done on land. So there's a big push for and I know actually some state governments, especially South Australia, are really actively engaging with the local Indigenous community, especially the Kaurna community in South Australia, and are really trying to think about how to basically pair seaweed farming and ocean farming that involves seaweed, with First Nations justice and giving them their sea country back. So there is some really amazing work happening there. But on the other hand, you are seeing the Australian government try to scale up this industry, and in doing so, usually the pitches that can build larger seaweed farms, usually are monocropped, are usually the pitches that win because they can scale. So that's a little bit more controversial for me. But I mean, yeah, as I said, most of my energy in terms of seaweed farming and ways that it can be done really well come from North America, Alaska as well. I was connected in with Julie, who's part of the fisheries in Alaska, and it's just like a totally different cultural thing. So many more people rely on the ocean ecosystem for their livelihoods. And then you have regulations which essentially stop the prevalence of larger boats and stuff. Like even like the fleet can only have X amount of large boats. Stuff like that just doesn't exist in Australia yet. So the US is where it's all happening.
That's really interesting to hear that perspective, because through my education and also just generally being in the environmental studies, marine science sphere, I've learned a lot about those kinds of topics, also including the more political side. And also there's a lot being added into the educational university experience for me about working with Native communities and approaching things like farming from a more sustainable or just broader, interconnected, regenerative perspective. It's all really interesting and exciting and very complex to get into. But yeah, I think it's a great conversation to go from.
I feel like also part of this is that these are like complex ecosystems that sometimes it's hard to put words around it and stuff. But I mean, I'm super hopeful that given the right cultural narratives and stories and people telling stories and sharing stories, that we'll totally do the right thing. That's what we've done for most of human history, is the right thing. So yeah, I'm super hopeful. It's just getting that connective tissue, i.e. the stories that we tell each other, to be a little bit more grounded.
I think that is a great place to end unless there's anything. Is there anything else, final thoughts that you'd like to add in?
I guess I would say that if most of your listeners are kind of tuning in from America, that to my knowledge, the book's only kind of like largely available in Australia. But if you are in the state of Maine and if you are also in Alaska, there are copies in public libraries, in elementary schools. There's stuff floating around. So, I mean, I would love to tell people my Instagram handle, because if people do find this book in America, I would love to know about it. People can follow me at, I've got a pretty funny Instagram handle. It's at Send Kelp. So yeah, people listening out there, if you please reach out to me, I'd love to hear about where the book is ending up, especially if it's overseas. And if there are any people in the American publishing world that want to publish this book, that would be amazing, because then it becomes readily available. So hopefully in the future, we'll see my book kind of stretch out its fronds and work its way into America, because in many respects, that's where I've got a lot of my energy around. Definitely the native connection to the ocean and to landscapes, but also to really kind of interesting ways of farming seaweed regeneratively. So yeah, DM me.
It is also available online, which is a little bit of a hurdle that you may not have access to, but I got my copy online, so it is a possibility if you're really interested in looking into this book, which I would totally recommend. I loved reading it. And it's also a huge book. Like, I got it in the mail and I was like surprised by the size of it.
Yeah, it's good value.
Yeah, it's worth it. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, that was fun. Bye.
Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, to suggest a guest, or if you're interested in sponsoring the show or donating to Breach the Surface, please visit our website at breachthesurface.org or find us on social media at Breach the Surface. To learn more about Matt, you can visit his website at matbate.com or his Instagram at _sendkelp. With a Little Kelp from Our Friends is available for purchase online, and a link can be found in our episode description.